can Disney make a good film anymore?
By the mid-80s, the Walt Disney Company was in trouble.
No one wanted to work for Disney.
After releasing flop after flop after flop, The House of Mouse was at one of the weakest points in its history.
Are they afraid of Walt Disney's memory or something?
This left the door wide open for a single studio to take advantage of Disney while they were down. And they did it with a Hollywood superstar.
Got things going for us, and maybe even for the industry.
A disenchanted former Disney animator.
We can do it better, and that's what we did.
And a style and look that Walt Disney Animation had all but given up on. How did these filmmakers go from making animated shorts in their garage to the films that define so many of our childhoods? And what was their misstep that led to the great animation war of the late 1980s? Well, today we find out as we unearth the surprising history behind the two films that briefly buried Disney, and how it all started with a mouse. Well, mice. And a dinosaur.
In America, you can say anything you want, but most important, in America, there are no cats.
Now, before we get into just how much drama was involved with both An American Tail and The Land Before Time, it's important to understand. In the early 1980s, Disney and feature animation in general were in a historically bad place.
I remember going over to the Disney studios, and it had not been refurbished. This was like, they had built it in like 1958 and hadn't changed a whit.
Yeah, it was on its kind of its last legs at that point.
It looked like a Greyhound
right?
bus station in Selma, Alabama.
Yeah. The studio had never fully recovered from the death of Walt Disney in 1966. And rather than investing in new technology and techniques to bring their brand of storytelling to a new generation of children, the studio dug in and looked for even cheaper ways to do what they had always done. By the time the 1980s had rolled around, this string of good but not great animated movies was affecting both critical and commercial perception. Adding to this was the fact that Disney was taking on a ton of risk in the live action department, which unfortunately resulted in a ton of box office disappointment.
When you see a film like this from Disney, they always seem to be about 2 years late and about 2 beats slow.
And it wasn't just audiences and critics that had become disenchanted by Disney. On the inside, many of the artists were growing restless. While all of this turmoil at the animation studio was happening, there were two monumental shifts on the horizon. Shifts that would alter the direction of the entire animation industry and plant the seeds for one of Disney's biggest and most brutal battles. Within the walls of Walt Disney Animation, a revolution was brewing. A small but significant group of young artists had grown increasingly frustrated with the countless corners they were being asked to cut, and feared that the company had completely forgotten about so many of the techniques that made Disney, Disney. At the head of this group was a talented animator named Don Bluth. Having started at the studio in 1955 working on Sleeping Beauty, and then eventually on films like Robin Hood, The Rescuers, Pete's Dragon, and The Fox and the Hound, Don had a front row seat to much of this cost-cutting over the years, and he was growing increasingly more concerned.
As I watched all these little things disappear, the mantra around the Disney studio was, we can't afford to do it anymore, it's too expensive. And I remember asking one of the animators, you know, in Fantasia, you've been here the whole history, how did you get that beautiful wet water in Fantasia where the little broom was carrying buckets, you know, and emptying water? How did you do that? And this guy, he said, I don't remember. And no, nobody wrote it down.
To combat this, a group of around 10 animators did what so many of the other young, frustrated creatives at Disney were doing at the time, and started work on their own side project, all out of Don's garage. It would be drawn from the ground up, utilizing the classic style that Disney no longer wanted to invest in. It would give the group an opportunity to flex their own creative muscles, and perhaps it would convince the higher-ups of just how much magic there still was in the techniques that Walt Disney had pioneered. And I bet you can't guess how that all went.
A bunch of us who had been working on that little film in my garage went into Disney's and said, unless we can change things here, we need to quit and go out and make our own films, and we will, this is so arrogant, and we will compete with you. We didn't even have a studio. We had my garage. So they laughed as we did this, but we handed in 17 resignations and went out to make the Banjo the Woodpile Cat to learn lessons on how to animate.
Though little did the Disney executives know at the time, but they had just fired the first shot in what would eventually erupt into the biggest modern-day animation war that the industry had ever experienced. But that's a little further on down the road. For now, Don and his small team of animators used Disney's rejection as fuel to complete their first animated short, Banjo the Woodpile Cat.
Bless you, darling. I'll miss you.
And while it only had a small release in 2 theaters and a short run on HBO and ABC, that was enough to get Don and the team noticed, leading them to be hired for a 2-minute animated sequence in 1980's Xanadu, which led them to be able to secure funding for a little film you may have heard of, with 1982's The Secret of NIMH.
Thank you. I will treasure it, always.
But it was the critical recognition that Don received with NIMH that led to one of the biggest opportunities in his career. And it introduces us to arguably the biggest player looking to take down Disney.
Steven Spielberg.
Steven Spielberg.
My name is Steve Spielberg, and I just directed a movie called Jaws.
Now, if there's anyone that doesn't need an introduction when it comes to Hollywood history, it's Steven Spielberg. But what you might not know about the guy is just how much respect he's had for the art of animation.
I'm so in love with the Disney animators. Why I think animation is the father of cinema, live action cinema, because they have to have in their mind a clear picture of how a chipmunk rolls over in the snow. They got to know what each side of that chipmunk looks like. And they don't build chipmunks and roll them over into fake snow. They have to use their imaginations and paint these things 12 cells a second. And how the fur moves and how the wind's blowing. And it's just, that's why I think all directors should be animators first.
And any child of the 90s would be able to tell you just how hard in the paint he went when it came to producing animation for television.
A Steven Spielberg show!
But in the 1980s, Steven Spielberg hadn't quite gotten there yet. He had, though, made the realization that turning his own ideas into big-budget blockbusters wasn't just quite fulfilling enough. In 1980, he co-founded Amblin Entertainment so that he could help other up-and-comers turn their ideas into big-budget blockbusters. And, of course, take a bit of the credit and a cut of the box office royalties.
I thought I'd leave you with a brief preview of Steven Spielberg's Back to the Future. Actually, that's not quite right. Spielberg was only one of 3 executive producers. The director of the film, who should take the credit, was Robert Zemeckis, who also co-wrote the script. And yet, the power of Spielberg's name is such that these days, any film with which he's associated seems to become automatically a colossal box office hit.
Regardless of all that, though, in 1984, Steven Spielberg was on the hunt for new and exciting ideas for Amblin to produce. And little did he know at the time, but a chance screening of The Secret of NIMH that his friend and composer Jerry Goldsmith had insisted he see would open up a whole new world for both Steven Spielberg and Amblin Entertainment.
Jerry Goldsmith took the movie Secret of NIMH to Steven Spielberg. And Steven said, I thought that this kind of animation died with the golden age of animation. He called us on the phone and he said, would you like to make a movie with me? We said, yes, we would. So he had a story which turned out to be American Tail.
And while, yeah, we did end up with an American Tail, getting to the finished film wouldn't exactly be easy. Just getting the basic story in place took Steven Spielberg almost 2 full years.
And when he finally found the story, it was something called Mousy Mouskowitz. And he said, we'll rename it. And he said, we'll name it my grandfather's name, which was Fievel. And then as we started, he says, you go ahead and storyboard it. And then show me your storyboards. If I agree, I'm going to give you money, and I'm going to give you time. Make a movie I can be proud of that I can put my name on. And that was basically it.
Basically it would of course be a major oversimplification, because not only would Spielberg's obsession with the visual art of storytelling take over Don's production sessions.
People look at storyboards that I thought everything was working, the continuity was working, the emotions were working, the staging was even working, in fact, brilliant. And he would come in and say, no. This would be better if you did this and this and this. Put your camera up above and look down on the characters so they look small.
But it became very clear early on that Spielberg wasn't content with his first animated movie just being successful. He needed his $9 million tale about a young Jewish family of mice emigrating from Russia to the United States in the late 1800s to be a blockbuster. And so Universal Pictures, Amblin Entertainment, and Don Bluth began gearing up to make An American Tail an industry-defining multimedia event.
Steven Spielberg presents the story of Fievel, lost in a world of strangers.
I'm looking for my family.
Along the way, he meets Digit, Bridget, and Tony Toponi, Gussie Mausheimer, Honest John, and Tiger.
You in the front. Higher, higher.
America. What a place.
An American Tail.
So how exactly do you turn an animated movie about a young Jewish mouse trying to find his family in 1880s New York into a 1980s pop culture media event?
Merchandising! Where the real money from the movie is made.
And this all started in the very early design phase, with the studio and Don Bluth working with Sears executives to craft the characters in a way that would maximize their marketability, which of course led to the stuffed animal.
You'll find Fievel only at Sears.
There's more for your life.
The McDonald's Happy Meal books.
Now McDonald's Happy Meal has colorful storybooks based on the new movie An American Tail.
The McDonald's Christmas stocking.
'Twas the night before Christmas when all through the house not a creature was stirring except Fievel the mouse.
Which is an interesting tie-in for a movie about the Jewish immigration experience.
Happy Hanukkah.
But the most important marketing tie-in of all ended up being the music. This was something pushed heavily by Steven Spielberg, who recognized the wider appeal that a song like Hi-Ho had brought to Walt Disney's Snow White. And so, for his first animated film, Spielberg didn't just want An American Tail to be a musical. He wanted the soundtrack to include a single that could stand on its own. Though it's safe to say that even after recruiting both Linda Ronstadt and James Ingram to record the wide release version, even he couldn't have anticipated just how big Somewhere Out There would become. Not only did it end up a radio mainstay throughout the 80s and 90s, spending 22 weeks on the Billboard Hot 100 and peaking at number 2, not only was it nominated for Best Original Song at the Golden Globes and Academy Awards, but it actually won a Grammy for Song of the Year.
Somewhere Out There. James Horner.
Now I know what you're saying. All of this marketing and merchandising is all well and good, but what about, the actual film? Well, critically it was pretty mixed. Film reviewers praised the music and beautiful classic Disney style of animation, but many of them also weren't so thrilled with just how dark the movie is at times, and called out that it feels like the central Jewish side of the story is being downplayed.
It would be obvious to most grown-ups watching this film that Fievel and his family are Jewish, and that's why the troops of the Russian Tsar in 19th century Russia burned down their homes and sent them into exile. But the movie never mentions that point. This seems to be a Jewish parable that doesn't want to declare itself.
It could only be that they think that's too ethnic and won't make money at the box office.
Though even with all of that, when American Tail finally did premiere on November 21st, 1986, it broke all of the box office estimates. By the time it ended its theatrical run, it made just over $40 million domestically on a production budget of $9 million. Not only had Spielberg and Bluth been able to beat out Song of the South's 40th anniversary re-release, which had arrived in theaters the exact same day as An American Tail, they were also able to beat The Great Mouse Detective, Disney's latest and greatest animated film, which had released 4 months earlier over the summer and still managed to make less while costing more. For Don Bluth, this was a victory 7 years in the making. For Steven Spielberg, this was a sign that the world of animation was his for the taking. And for Disney, this was a warning. But behind the scenes, changes at the House of Mouse were brewing. The animation department once again had a Disney at the helm, and he was ready to do everything in his power to maintain control of the industry that his family had helped build.
You know, in 1984, Disney was on the financial pages much more than the movie pages of the newspapers.
Well, that's right, so.
With terrible rows apparently going on one way or another. Do you think that has damaged the Disney image?
I don't see any evidence of that at all. And I think the fact that there is a Disney back at Disney now has probably helped us a little bit.
By the time An American Tail hit theaters, the Walt Disney Company was in the middle of a significant restructure. 2 years earlier, Walt's nephew Roy E. Disney had successfully convinced the board to clean house and bring in a new executive team, with Michael Eisner as CEO and Jeffrey Katzenberg as chair of the film division. And when both Eisner and Katzenberg had the bright idea of shutting down the animation studio and outsourcing everything instead, it was Roy that intervened and was named the new chairman of feature animation.
We began to get back to, and I sort of came back too at that time. I'd been away and suggested that we ought to be looking at animation again as the roots and the fundaments on which everything else
because everything
rests.
in this company.
Disney's first animated film under this new regime proved to be a modest success, with The Great Mouse Detective more than doubling its budget. But those good vibes wouldn't last long, because as soon as An American Tail took the media landscape by storm, it was clear that more changes were needed. And there was no way that they were going to let a first-timer in Steven Spielberg and Don Bluth, one of their own former animators, beat them at their own game. Disney would need to be bigger. Disney would need to be better. Disney would need to go to war. As An American Tail was wrapping up, discussions between the studio and Don Bluth began to take place about what their follow-up might be. Would they want to do a sequel following the further adventures of Fievel? Should it be focused around some other kind of animal, or maybe even humans? But at that time, Steven Spielberg was just starting to become obsessed with making a dinosaur movie. And while this was still well before his own live-action state-of-the-art dino movie, Spielberg knew a very influential guy that had his own idea on what this might look like.
He says, you know what, I have a friend I know named George Lucas. Would you guys like to do a dinosaur picture with me too? And George? I'd always called him Mr. Lucas. Sure, with you and George, that'd be fun. So George Lucas came down from his tower where he lives, and we sat in the conference room again. George did not want this animated. He had been working on a dinosaur picture for a long time, and he wanted it done with some kind of animatronics or puppets. But Steven prevailed, and he said, well, let's do this while we're waiting. There'll always be dinosaurs.
Trouble began almost immediately, though, as each of these creative forces and their creative focus took off in very different directions. Spielberg took off to Asia to make Empire of the Sun, while Lucas remained in his California compound to produce Willow. Though they at least did leave Don Bluth with a very simple direction for what would soon be known as The Land Before Time.
Just get started. Get started, he said. It's about 5 little dinosaurs, and there's an earthquake, and they get separated from their parents, and now they're journeying together to the Great Green Valley to find a home. And that's what the story's about. So just get started.
The problem was, Don was in the middle of his own directional shift. Rising production costs, difficulties with the US Animation Union, and a big old government subsidy led to him moving a majority of the studio over to Ireland. Not surprisingly, this disconnected feedback loop between Bluth, Spielberg, Lucas, and Universal made any kind of communication and collaboration exceedingly difficult. And sadly, this all came to a head during Don's first presentation of The Land Before Time's rough cut.
Steven, at the end of looking at it, says, too scary.
too scary. I'm going to have the moms out there with their kids, and they're going to be crying. He says we have to edit. So they cut out scenes that are already in color, already done, already dubbed, everything. Cut them out and threw them away. And so what you saw was a watered down, but it's still scary, of the picture. And that really hurt to do that.
Despite Don's objections, about 19 scenes were cut or completely reworked to tone down the overall intensity. This left the final runtime of the film at only 69 minutes, making it one of the shortest widely released animated features at the time. And even worse, this kind of a power play by Spielberg had completely shattered his working relationship with Don Bluth. But despite all of this, they had a film in the can that was ready for release. All Amblin Entertainment and Universal Pictures had to do was sell their endearingly dark dinosaur movie to the masses. The thing was, this time around, the pool of available marketing partners had shrunken dramatically, all thanks to Disney, who just so happened to also have their own animated film on the horizon.
Every holiday season, Walt Disney brings you the finest in animated movies. Now, that proud tradition continues as we present our newest full-length animated feature, Oliver and Company.
A pussycat?
Don't worry, Kitty. I'll take care of you.
It's an all-new musical adventure featuring 5 new songs and pure Disney magic.
Absolutely.
Only in theaters, it's Walt Disney Pictures' Oliver and Company.
But most troubling was the fact that Disney had purposefully chosen to premiere Oliver and Company, the studio's 27th animated feature film, on the exact same day as The Land Before Time. And on top of that, they had made sure to snap up many of the best marketing partnerships. And so rather than Sears...
And you can take the fun home with you with a complete line of kids' clothes from Sears.
Universal and Amblin had to pivot to JCPenney.
Come to JCPenney, where you and your children can find your very own Littlefoot and all his dinosaur friends, clothes, and much more.
And instead of McDonald's...
Now when you buy a $5 book of McDonald's gift certificates, you get a free plush musical ornament of Oliver or Dodger.
They had to go with Pizza Hut.
With a pizza from Pizza Hut, a Land Before Time dinosaur is only 99 cents.
Despite all of this, The Land Before Time still managed to soar both critically and commercially. Reviewers continued to call out the incredible animation reminiscent of Disney's golden era, and found warmth in the story of Littlefoot and his crew of misfit dinosaurs in search of the Great Valley.
This picture I happen to enjoy. I thought that, and I guess you did too.
Yeah, I did,
okay.
yeah.
I thought that it was sweet more than it was scary. I thought it was quite beautiful, and I think its story, despite unlike the one we just talked about before, is a straight line. In other words, it's very clear, it's set up very early on that will the Brontosaurus live, or is it going to be eaten up by the Tyrannosaurus Rex? And you got a baby you could follow, and it's a straight line story. I think this is the film that I would recommend for children to see.
Oh, and that film that they're recommending, The Land Before Time over? Oliver and Company.
I didn't care for the film. You did.
I gave it a marginal...
Why are you recommending it?
It was harmless. It was inoffensive. There were some moments that were funny. I liked the little Mexican Chihuahua.
The Chihuahuas, they should make the film.
The animation looked good. I don't know.
When both films premiered the week of November 18th, 1988, Land Before Time opened #1 at the domestic box office, with Oliver and Company landing at #4. And by the time the dust settled in late January, the two films had been duking it out for over 10 weeks, with Oliver eventually pulling ahead and eking out the overall win. Though, once international box office was factored in, it was Land Before Time that had the higher total. Either way you slice it, it was yet another victory for the team of Spielberg and Bluth. And they had once again done it with less resources and half of the budget of their competition. Don Bluth, a dispirited Disney animator, had set out to prove that those classic animation techniques still had some juice left in them. Steven Spielberg, the up-and-coming king of Hollywood, had set out to show that his ideas could conquer more than just the world of live action. They had both accomplished what they had originally set out to do. And while the path ahead seemed clear, this isn't quite how things worked out. Don had had enough of the endless creative oversight he experienced over these last 4 years, and so he set off to make his own animated movies with his brand new facility in Ireland.
Our staff is about 380 strong right now. We have almost, I would say, 320 that are Irish. It is becoming fast more and more just simply an Irish studio.
Spielberg also had no intention of slowing things down and got to building his own state-of-the-art animation studio that would begin work on his next American tale.
The film that we're seeing produced out of this facility is the best animation that I've ever been involved with, and all this work will create for us my dream, which is to have for the rest of all of our careers a thriving animation studio somewhere in the world.
And Disney? Well, they weren't satisfied with just competing. They needed to dominate. And now with 2 studios coming for their crown, they needed to produce a whole lot more if they were going to win this war.
Can you really afford to do what you want to do in animation as much as you want to do?
The answer is no, but we're doing it anyway. We have to do it in this company.
Have to.
We have to. That is our legacy.
But Disney had a plan that would usher in an entire renaissance for the animation division. A plan that would take audiences to the deepest depths of the sea, to a dazzling castle under a beastly curse. Disney had a whole new world that they were preparing to unveil to a whole new generation. But even they couldn't have predicted where things would eventually end up and how their own overconfidence would once again lead to a figure from their past coming back to haunt them.
A new movie and entertainment studio was launched today in Hollywood. But this is no ordinary studio. It's headed by 3 of the biggest names in entertainment, giving the new venture instant credibility and a lot of clout.
But if you thought that the rise of Spielberg and Bluth's animation studio was wild, you don't want to miss the second chapter of this story. But while I'm finishing that one up, check out my video on Disney's fight to save Mickey Mouse from irrelevancy.